Thanks very much for coming. My friend Aaron Brown is a principal of a hedge fund in Connecticut, and he's also a professional poker player. So he kind of straddles two worlds in which risk is equally important and which have a lot to say to each other. And one of the questions he likes to ask young traders when they're applying for a job in his hedge fund is, tell me about a time when you really wanted something and then took risks, a risk or some risks to get it. So I'd just like you to take 2 minutes to think about what your answer to that question might be. If you were applying for a job at Aaron's hedge fund and you were sitting there and he asked you, tell me about a time in your life when you really wanted something and took a risk to get it. Just have a think about that for a minute, and then if you want to, share it with the person next to you, but you don't, if it's particularly, some people when they think about this, they kind of think about some rather kind of private or risque matters. So you might not want to share it, but if you feel that, it's not too personal, please share it with the person next to you. Okay, so would anyone does anyone feel brave enough to share their story with the rest of the whole audience here? Does anyone have something sufficiently harmless to share? Would you want to put the hand up? Is anyone brave enough? Yeah. Do you want to wait for the mic to come?
I was late for work in Holland, and the bridge separates, and it takes about another 20 minutes for the bridge to come back down again, for the dams. So down comes the barrier, and I raced for it, and the bridge was separating, and I sped up and went over about 6 foot of the bridge, and turned around and I was like, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Do we have anyone else who's brave enough to share their risk story? Yeah? Wait, if you could just wait for the mic to come.
I left a wage in 2008 to go to retrain in what I really wanted to do, and haven't got a wage since. So I don't know if it's paid off or not. Okay,
yeah, but that's okay, great, thank you. So then, having kind of told you only half the question, I can now follow up with the sucker punch, which is, how did you analyze the risks? Okay, silence. Does anyone, if you'd like to spend another, maybe 1 minute, tell the people next to you, how did you analyze the risks when you took your risky decision? And I'll come back in a minute. Okay, so would anyone like to share what sort of things did you think about when you were analyzing the risks? Do we have any volunteers? Yeah. This guy with the blue shirt.
So previous experience, what had happened in a similar situation in the past?
Okay, great. So you can draw on some relevant previous experience. Anyone else? Yep.
Are you asking about analysing the risk before you took the jump?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I have to tell you what it was first,
sure.
And I wanted to gauge how personal people were going before I shocked everybody. Abandoning a secure marriage to find independence, to see was I capable of surviving on my own and could I do it. I analysed the risk by coming to rely on the inner strength I believed I had developed.
So you thought about the resources you could draw on to make it a success. How else could you what other kind of things did you think about when you were trying to make that decision, when you were thinking about, why was it a risky decision? What was risky about it? I can think of plenty of possibilities, but what was salient for you?
The main risk was once I removed myself from what was what was a secure situation, maybe from financial considerations as opposed to mental. What the main risk was, what did you ask me exactly?
So what was
could
the
I
risk?
get out there? And the risk was, could I do it?
Right.
Or would I end up in a hole in the side of the road?
So it was like what you were risking was your sanity.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
and my
okay.
ability
Your
to survive and to put food on the table.
Okay,
and
financial
to live
risks as well.
securely
Okay.
and mentally.
And mental.
Could I survive on my own resources?
Great. Thank you very much for sharing that. Because, okay, so here a perfect answer for Aaron Brown. The three things that he's looking for when he asks this question are firstly, a clearly desirable reward. Okay, something that's clearly desirable, that you're taking the risk for. Right? Secondly, a significant but commensurable risk. So it's, if you didn't have to take any risk to get it, this is not an interesting story to tell. You fail, okay? You don't get the job. But if it's the risk is way too great, if it's so massively much greater than is justified by the reward, it's incommensurable, you fail too. And thirdly, a solid and sophisticated analysis of the actual risks. How did you weigh up the risks? How did you gauge them? How did you work out how likely they were, what the impact would be, and so on? Now, in 20 years of using these questions in interviews, nobody has got a perfect answer. So that just tells you something about the average level of risk intelligence in the general population, even among people who are going for jobs at a hedge fund, where you would hope that they would be slightly better at judging risk. But Aaron now has a kind of another list of about 11 criteria that he looks for in answers. And if people just get 2 of these, he gives them the job. Because again, a lot of people don't get any of them. And then again, that tells you something about how poor most of us are at thinking about risks. So one criterion that he looks for in a good answer is leading with the reward. That means you come out and say first what it was that you wanted to get out of this. Why are you taking the risk in the first place, okay? So, if you started off the sentence with something like, I had a mad lust for the high school nurse, that would be good, right? Because you're starting with something that you want. You're saying, this is why, then you go along and say what the risks are, why you took it, and so on. A second criterion that he's looking for in a good answer would be that you would have to be aware of at least some of the risks without wild misjudgment. So if you said something like, I knew I could get arrested, but I didn't think I'd get more than a small fine if I was prosecuted, then that again, it may be a good thing because you're aware of the risk, you're not exaggerating them, you're not minimizing them. Thirdly, he is also looking for an awareness that there are probably some incalculable risks too. Something that you know is a risk, but you just really haven't got any idea how to gauge what it is, but you're aware that it's out there. So it's kind of not an unknown, if you like. It's a known unknown. So you could, and you then an attempt at least to bring to bear, as the gentleman over there was saying, some relevant knowledge, some prior experience, even if it's relatively distantly related, if you can figure out a way to tap into any bits of knowledge you have and make some relationship with the risk, you can begin to get more of a sort of an idea of how to weigh it up. So, for example, I didn't know my chances of finding him or what dangers there were out there in the woods. But I figured I hadn't read of anyone dying out there in the last year, and I knew a lot of inexperienced hikers had gone in and come out okay. So you're drawing on bits of knowledge that you have. It's not making it into a completely, perfectly analyzable thing, but you're bringing some relevant knowledge to bear. Fourthly, another criterion he's looking for, an honest and precise summary of the results. Another criterion would be and these two are linked, the next two. Firstly, on the one hand, satisfaction, if it was the right decision, satisfaction at making the right decision, rather than from getting a good outcome. And conversely, if it was the wrong decision, regret at making the wrong decision rather than from getting a bad outcome. And I think that's crucial. The people who are really good at making these risky decisions, people with high risk intelligence, are very good at separating the process, the decision-making process from the outcome. You know, they are happy if they made the right decision, even if they got a wrong outcome. And they don't, if the outcome is not what they wanted, fine. So long as they made the decision correctly, that's great. Conversely, if they got a fantastic outcome, but they look back and they realize that it was just pure luck because they made the decision in a really, irrational way, that they get upset about that. They're more focused on the quality of the decision-making process because they know that whether or not you get the right outcome is partly a function of how well you make the decision and partly a function of luck. You can never guarantee that you'll get the right outcome. A good decision-making process, by definition, should make it more likely that you'll get a good outcome, but that's all it can do. There's no guarantee. As Clint Eastwood says in the film The Rookie, if you want a guarantee, buy a toaster. So another criterion he's looking at is real effort to research the situation, presuming you've got enough time to research it, that is. Another thing is no joking about failure or minimizing it. If it went wrong, if you failed, you don't, this is funny really, it doesn't really matter to me, Like, don't say that, If you say, look, I fucked up and it was really, really, really bad. If you can have the honesty to say that, then you can learn from the situation, and then that means you can get better. If you don't admit when you've made a mistake, you can't learn from the situation. And that's actually something that with all the expert gamblers that I've interviewed, and I'll talk about that in a minute, that they're all really brutally honest with themselves, and as a result, they get really good at learning from their mistakes. And sort of similar, on the other hand, if you're successful, there's no smugness about the success. You're perfectly aware that things could easily have gone the other way. As a result, as I say, that means you can learn from the experience, and finally, you really cared about the outcome. So that's 11 criteria. As I say, most people don't get any of them. Some get one, occasionally someone gets 2 or 3, and if they get 2 or 3 in their answer, Aaron gives them a job. But the fact that that's his threshold for giving them a job is so low, as I say, kind of speaks to how badly most of us actually think about risk and how low risk intelligence is on average, and how we don't really get much training or at school or in life for thinking about these things carefully. So some bad answers, and these are remarkably common. Firstly, no answer. It's amazing how many people just can't answer the question. It says, why are you here? You coming for a job in a hedge fund. I ask you, tell me a time when you wanted something, no answer, fail. So another thing, never took risks, fail. Another thing, never wanted anything that badly. It's like, what are you doing in a hedge fund? You've got to be you've got to want to get rich. You've got to really want it. Never analyzed risks, okay, that's pretty obvious. Only considered emotional risks. This is really interesting, I think, because so this is, this is where you would fail. Because, no, actually, you would good, but your reward was emotion. So you probably would fail there, but your risks were genuinely physical. But if you only consider emotional risks, it's a bad answer because, successful traders don't think of taking risks with their feelings in the same way that they think of risks with objective things like health and money. And the reason for that is that, feelings are important, but they can be gamed. You can play all sorts of games with yourself in your head that makes your bad feeling less bad. This is the sour grapes thing. Oh, I never really wanted it. Oh, it wasn't that bad. Oh, maybe it's a learning experience, all of this kind of stuff. If you lose, you can make yourself feel better by reframing the situation in some way. If you win, you could make yourself feel worse for any of the sort of perverse reasons that make us human. So traders, the people that Aaron is looking for when he wants to give someone a job in his hedge fund, is someone who's focusing on the risks where the outcome is objective. They're going to lose a limb, they're going to lose a significant amount of money, these are things that you can't lie about. You can't say to yourself, oh, I didn't really lose that money, or I didn't really, break my arm. You can't lie about that. You can't reframe it. This is an objective thing, and so therefore it's a way of kind of keeping yourself honest, and that's the way the traders think. As I say, it's not. This is a specific kind of risk taker he's looking for. Another bad answer would be, instead of leading with the reward, leading with the risk. So instead of saying, I really, had this need to establish myself as the greatest climber in the world, break the world record or something, that's the reward. You might say, well, look, I climbed an 8,000-meter peak in the Andes, even though the weather report was so bad that most of the other climbers stayed in base camp. So you're starting with the risk. That's not what Aaron's looking for, because he doesn't want people who take risks just for the sake of taking risks. Maybe the reward was the risk itself. He's not interested in that. Maybe the person takes risks for no reward. He's certainly not interested in that. Or maybe the reward was unstated and unanalyzed, or maybe the reward was an emotion, like feeling great. I do that kind of thing all the time, but that's not what Aaron's looking for. He doesn't want people where the risk is emotional. He doesn't want to talk to people where the reward is emotional. He wants to think about real objective risks, things that you can lose big time and where you can gain big time. That's how traders think. And finally, another kind of aspect of a really bad answer would be wildly misjudging the risk. So, for example, I bought 5 ounces of pot in Mexico. I crossed the border into the US with it in the glove compartment of my car. Because they never look in the glove compartment. Obviously, you haven't really analyzed that risk, adequately. So these are, I think, what Aaron's trying to get at with these questions, with this question and his criteria for analyzing the answers, is the idea that some people are just better at thinking about risk than others, and that most people are pretty bad at it. That's why very few people get a job at his hedge fund. So, but what is it that sets these people apart, the people who are good at thinking about risk, from the rest of us who are not naturally good at it or haven't had much practice in it? And whatever that thing is, that set of mental capacities, that was really what I set out to try and identify when I started investigating this a few years ago. And I started because I was teaching in a medical school at the time, and my medical students were really bad at estimating the probabilities. So they would say, I would ask them to estimate that, we'd present them with a typical case history, then I'd say, what's the chance that this person has pneumonia? Or whatever the relevant kind of disease in question was. If it was a respiratory condition, what's the chance that they've got tuberculosis or something? And they would always give wild percentages, often way too high. So they were way overconfident. They would say, oh, look, there's a 90% chance this person has pneumonia. And it was like, actually, when you figure it out, you should be really saying I had like a 10% chance or a 5% chance. So you're being massively overconfident. You're saying, I'm almost 100% sure this person has this condition, but in fact you should be kind of saying it's a very unlikely. So I knew this was a kind of common phenomenon. I'd studied the literature on judgment decision-making before. So I wasn't that surprised by finding that most of my students were bad at this. But then I began to think, well, how can we make them better? And so I started reading more in the literature, and then I realized that actually, the conclusion seemed to be that you can't make people better. These cognitive biases that afflict us and affect us all, the consensus seemed to be that they're so universal and hardwired and innate that you can't overcome them. We're kind of condemned to be bad at estimating probabilities for the rest of our lives. But then, as I read further, I began to come across occasional sort of oddball studies that had been, really interesting, quirky studies that had been done and published and then forgotten about because they didn't seem to fit into an overall pattern. And, science has fashions and fads like anything else. So I came across a study of horse race handicappers who some of them were absolutely brilliant at estimating the chances that a horse would win a race. Way better than they seem to have overcome their cognitive biases. Another study was of weather forecasters in the US, and not in the UK or Ireland. And that's not because the weather here is harder to predict, believe it or not. It's because it turns out in the US, since 1965, all their weather forecasters have been required to put numbers on things. If you've been to the US or listened to a weather forecast over there, you'll have heard that they don't just say, oh, it'll probably rain tomorrow. Or we don't think it's unlikely to rain tomorrow. They say there's a 5% chance of rainfall tomorrow. There's a 15% chance it'll snow tomorrow. There's a 75% chance. They're actually putting probabilities on things. So that began to make, that put me on, that gave me my first hunch about what the difference was between the people who were good at doing it and the people who were not good, is that they kind of got used to using this language of numbers, the language of probabilities. And what they were doing was they were using these probabilities to, in a sense, quantify their own subjective uncertainty. When they said there's a 75% chance that this horse will win a race, they were saying something both about the external world, about the horse itself, something that was objectively measurable, because you could, if you used these probabilities correctly, you could make money. If you were better than the bookies at estimating the horse's chance of winning a race, you could spot when they had were offering odds that were too long, and you could take advantage of that. They're called overlays, and you could make a profit. And I talked to people who had done that for a living. And in fact, I spoke to one guy who made over $500 million from doing this. And that made me wonder whether I was actually in the right job. He was, and this guy said, he was like a scientist. He gathered all this data about the horses, he plugged it into his computer model, and I said, you could be a scientist. And he said, yeah, but why would I be a scientist? I would earn like a fraction of what I'm earning. I said, yeah, but think about, that you could be answering the universe, the physical laws of nature, discovering, all these great things. He said, yeah, well, look, the secret to being a professional gambler, he said, is you have to be smart enough to know how to do it and dumb enough to think it matters. So, that's why he wasn't a scientist. He was quite happy to be dumb enough to think that, just making hundreds of millions of dollars was kind of all he really wanted. And that was fine. But so he was, good at putting numbers on things. He was good at estimating that, and he was better than the bookies, and that's why he could take money from the bookies. In Hong Kong, he was actually betting on the tote, so it meant that he wasn't actually taking money from the bookies, he was taking money from the other punters. So, that's the way markets work, right? A few smart traders take profit off the vast majority of noise traders, whether that's a betting market or a financial market. So another study I looked at was a study of bridge players, and they were pretty good at it too. And they were, that sort of led me to another hunch, which was that another difference between the people who were really good at this and the rest of us was that not only that they were used to putting numbers on things, but they got very good, quick, rapid, precise feedback. When you're playing bridge, you can make a rough estimate of how likely you are to win this hand or this round, or make your contract, I should say. But and you'll find out whether you're right or wrong, whether you made the contract or not, within a few minutes. And the weather forecasters, they would find out the next day whether they were right or wrong. But the doctors would sometimes never find out whether they were right or wrong. So when I looked at studies of doctors, they often had very low risk intelligence, just like my medical students, because they got really poor feedback. Sometimes their patients wouldn't come back, sometimes they might find out months later. So, it's not just that doctors are like dumb or anything. It's just that they actually don't have the right conditions for developing risk intelligence. Then I thought, well, if that's the only thing that matters, if it's not really innate, if it's about having the right conditions, then anybody could get better at this if we have the right conditions. So, in other words, if anybody kind of gets used to starting to put numbers on things, estimating the probabilities, putting actual numbers, saying, I think there's a 15% chance that this will happen, a 25% chance that this will happen, and then they get precise, prompt feedback, anybody should be able to get better at doing this. And that's what, to cut a long story short, that's what we found. So if you'd like to take a free risk intelligence test, you can see what I mean by this. You can test out your own ability to put probabilities on things. Just go to my website, which is www.projectionpoint.com. Maybe we can sort of put that up on the screen later, I don't know. But that's also now what the it's techniques like this that the US intelligence services are using to train their intelligence analysts to get better at forecasting world events. So this was partly because, when the Arab Spring caught everyone completely by surprise in the intelligence community, Obama came down on the CIA and the FBI, really like a ton of bricks, saying, what were you doing, guys? You completely failed to spot this huge social transformation that is, spreading across the whole of the Middle East. Why didn't you see it coming? And but the good thing, intelligence bosses are used to this. Whenever anything goes wrong, they always get blamed by the political paymasters. But the great thing about it is that sometimes it comes with funding to get better. And so there was some funding then put into developing the human factors with intelligence. Because the problem isn't with all the analytical models. The problem is that the intelligence analysts are kind of not aware of how much they know and how much they don't know. And it's this which is really at the heart of risk intelligence. It's kind of knowing how much you know, and knowing when you know a lot and being appropriately confident, and knowing when you don't know very much and being appropriately cautious. Not being cautious when you in fact know a lot, because you're wasting time, and not being overconfident when you know actually a little, because you'll just make mistakes. So I think what we'll do is, that's all I'm going to say for my talk. I want to throw the thing open for questions now. So maybe we have a couple of roving mics. So does anyone have a question so far? Or I can talk some more about expert gamblers if not, but go on.
Do men and women assess risk differently, or older people and younger people, or different races, or any segmentation like that?
It's an we did look at that. In the data we've got, we've had over 40,000 people take our risk intelligence test yet, and we've sliced and diced the data by tons of ways. We can't really find any big differences between men and women, between nationalities, between educational levels, which is interesting. There's a slight benefit of education, because it seems to make people, not because of the primary knowledge, but because of a kind of Socratic effect, where the more you know, the more you realize how little you know. So as people get to know more, they actually also become more aware of the limits of their knowledge, which can lead to a very kind of curious thing where if it goes too far, they kind of get underconfident. And whereas the people who really had no education at all are really overconfident. So they can actually be less confident than the person who knows little, and the person who knows little can therefore project this aura of confidence and then gets voted into office and becomes president. And the rest is history. But this is actually known in the literature as the I've forgotten the name of it now. Yes, Dunning-Kruger effect. Thanks very much. So this was coined by, fairly recently, about 10 years ago, by two psychologists, Dunning and Kruger, who have several wonderful papers about this, where they talk about this sort of how ignorance has a sort of double whammy. Not only do ignorant people know very little, but they also are often unaware of how little they know, so that they can make terrible mistakes because they think they know stuff that they don't. This is the classic example that comes to my mind when I talk about this, is the sort of socially incompetent person who thinks they're really, dynamic at a party. And, it kind of goes around and everybody else can tell that they're an idiot, except them. And so, so I'm sure we've all come across people like that. That would be a classic example of incompetent and unaware of it. There's a small education effect. We did find one question that was suggested to me by the psychologist Susan Blackmore. She said, I'd really like you to just throw a question in there. Do you believe in the paranormal? Because I think you'll find a difference. And I was like, I was intrigued by this. So we put this question in shortly after the website went live. So we got most of the data, we missed a few thousand, but we got sort of 35,000 people who did the risk intelligence test and answered that question. And there was quite a big difference, and a statistically significant one, so that the skeptics had greater risk intelligence than the believers. And I found that very, very sort of reassuring, being a skeptic myself. But, and that it actually ties into interesting theories about why people are superstitious. And one of the theories there is that people misjudge probabilities. They underestimate the amount of chance in the world. When they, see a black cat cross their path and then, they trip over 5 minutes later, they think, the black cat caused the accident, right? So they see, this is, they underestimate the amount of chance. Yeah, what's the chance of that what might happen just randomly? Well, quite a lot, actually. It's the fact that they're misjudged, and this is an interesting kind of idea about why some people are more superstitious than others, because they misjudge probabilities. So that was the only kind of big difference we found, I guess, in terms so far. There are some personality traits that seem to make a difference. Extroverts tend to be less risk intelligent than introverts. People with a strong need for closure tend to be less risk. And these are people who must have an answer. People who, they don't care if it's a bad answer, but I want an answer now. Even, and they're not comfortable with that kind of negative, what Keats called negative capability, which, this ability, as he said, to remain in mystery without any irritable reaching after reason. It's not the reaching after reason that's the problem, it's the irritable reaching after reason. It's this kind of desire to know it now and not accept, so not to be comfortable with uncertainty. Yeah.
You're an extrovert who doesn't need closure.
Sorry?
I said, what if you're an extrovert who doesn't need closure? So you're one of the...
Well,
No, that's
yeah.
more joking. No, what I really wanted to ask you is that I want to make sure that I'm following.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about risk intelligence, does this go into money-making schemes? Is it to do with predicting everything in life? Can it filter into every area of your life? To do with weighing up, getting the history, understanding the history of what happened and using it to predict future things.
Yes.
I just find it very interesting that you talked about putting percentages.
Yeah.
And I hadn't ever thought like that, and it makes sense to me.
Yeah, okay, so this is raises a whole set of really interesting questions, which is, and I think it's quite complex, the answer. So on the one hand, yes, it has, you can apply it to everything. And one of the questions I would often ask when I went around the world interviewing some of the world's most successful gamblers, one question I would ask them is, do you find yourself thinking in this kind of way about everything else in life? Do you think about your relationships? Do you think about your, going shopping? Do you think about, driving or whatever in these terms? And they would say yes. They would almost, they would when, they were thinking, okay, shall I ask this girl out on a date? Well, what's the probability that she's going to say yes? How bad would I feel if she said no? And so on. And they would do expected utility calculation for the utility or not of these kind of things. So now, that doesn't mean that you can necessarily be equally good. Being good in one area of probability estimation will carry over into another. Because it seems that if you get, the really high scores for risk intelligence seem to be quite domain specific. So if you are absolutely brilliant at estimating the chances of a horse winning a race, it doesn't mean that you'll be necessarily brilliant at identifying the probabilities of stocks or shares going up and down. That's because what makes people, we're talking about what makes people not just good, but excellent at it is a very substantial practice in a particular domain. So they kind of have a lot of time to get a lot of feedback, and as a result, they build up quite a rich, largely unconscious mental model of the domain in question, where they kind of have a causal, kind of almost a causal model in their heads of, you know, the factors that go into making a horse good at running a race. But there is a little correlation. So there's sort of some low-hanging fruit when you start, which you can, some basic tricks for getting good at risk intelligence, like just being a little bit more cautious, because most people, the problem is overconfidence, it's not underconfidence. Most people think they know more than they do. So if they just, even just something as little as just being slightly less dogmatic can make you, can have some immediate payoff in terms of helping you get better at estimating probabilities. And people who get very good at risk intelligence in one domain, you know, they will get that low-hanging fruit pretty quickly, and that will carry over to other domains. But it will make them slightly better, maybe at picking stocks than a random person in the population, but it won't make them suddenly, you know, a brilliant sort of investor. But then, I guess the last thing I would say about this is that in order to for this to have some impact on your life, and to, you know, whether it means making you richer or less likely to be in an accident or whatever, you have to not just have good risk intelligence, but you need to have some way of using this kind of probabilities in making decisions. And that's actually probably the trickiest thing, because most of us, when we make decisions, we're not used to taking into account probabilistic information. We don't sort of say, well, should I take my umbrella? What's the chance of rainfall? We say, is it going to rain? Yes or no? We get used to we want categorical information, black or white binary information. We want to know, will it happen or won't it? And we know how to use that information. If somebody says, yes, it's going to rain, okay, I'll take my umbrella. No, it's not going to rain, okay, I'll leave it at home. But if somebody says, oh, there's a 63% chance of rainfall, what do? You know, how do you use that information to make a decision? And so, you know, it's pointless having the best risk intelligence in the world if you don't do anything with the resultingly wonderful probability estimates that you're regularly coming up with. So you have to find some way of making using that as an input into your decision-making process, whether it be like a threshold, is the simplest way. You know, you just say, well, I'm going to take my umbrella if the chance of rainfall is 70% or more. Fine, and each person can set their own threshold depending on, you know, how much they hate getting wet and how much they hate losing umbrellas. You know, or you could say, I'm only going to ask a girl out on a date if I think there's a 90% chance or more that she'll say yes or something, depending on how, or 5%, depending on how desperate you are, you know, and how much you hate getting rejected. So, you know, that's the simplest way. There are other methods that are more complicated, but that would be one simple way of doing it.
I have two things. The first is just a reflection on mindfulness, and if mindfulness practice or being mindful is a way of helping you cope with uncertainty, I wonder if there's a link to higher risk intelligence. But I'm really wondering if there's a downside to having high risk intelligence.
Oh, that's an interesting thing. Well, I'll take the first question first, because it's kind of, I think answer it more quickly. Anything that makes you more comfortable with uncertainty is going to help your risk intelligence, because I like to think of, you know, among the various things that get in the way of risk intelligence is this need for closure, which I talked about before, this burning desire to have an answer. But an opposite force is the sort of need to avoid closure, where these are the people who sort of don't, they always want more information before they give you an answer. You know, I need a bit more information, and they never make a decision. So kind of analysis paralysis. You know, and I think of people with high risk intelligence as kind of, those forces are still present in their minds, but they may be they cancel each other out. And so they can proceed with the work of judgment as in sort of uninfluenced. But most people, one of those forces is stronger than the other. So most people, they get drawn to, they either want to have an answer now, or they're the other thing of like refusing to commit themselves. So anything that made people sort of less sort of pulled by one of those emotional forces and made them just happier with states of uncertainty would probably be good. If mindfulness can do that, it seems plausible that it could do. Yeah, it'd be maybe an interesting study to do. But with regard, would there any downsides to risk intelligence? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's the financial crisis. There's tons of kind of relevant stories here. So the head of risk at HBS, sorry, bank, big global bank. He knew that they were taking on far too much risk. So he did his job. He went to the CEO, and he told the CEO, we are leveraged at some ridiculous ratio. We've got to start deleveraging because we're in for trouble. They fired him, right? So the problem is, sometimes people just don't want to hear the answer. The other banks are making a huge profit. We can't do, I'm going to be retired by the time this, the shit hits the fan, so I don't care. The incentives are all wrong. So, another thing about risk-intelligent people is they tend to be pretty blunt, and that can get you in trouble too. There's some great stories in Michael Lewis's book, The Big Short, which about one guy and you find that the people who called the financial crisis, the people who actually saw it coming and put the money where their mouth is and made a fortune when everybody else was going to hell in a handcart, they were all quite odd. One of them was a one-eyed guy with Asperger's syndrome. One of them was a sort of two guys working out of a basement that nobody, called Cornwall Capital. Everybody called Cornhole Capital because they thought it was crap. There was another guy called Iceman, who EIS, but he was kind of pretty much like an ice man because he was so cold. And he was pretty blunt. He was rude even by Wall Street standards. And so there's one story that Michael Lewis tells about how one day this Japanese CEO meets him and asks him to look at his balance sheet for his company. And he says, well, hang on, before I look at this, have you got money invested in your own company? And the interpreter sort of says, oh, no, this is not, people don't do this in Japan, they don't invest in their own companies. He says, well, why not? So then he says, well, look at your balance sheet. And he looks at it for a couple of minutes, then he hands it up like he's disposing of a turd. And he says, this is toilet paper. And this Japanese, this is a Japanese CEO who's used to massive respect, starts quaking, toilet paper! And it's just, this guy obviously didn't get any return business with this guy. So, I think, again, you have to be, I think it can, and also some people, people don't, it's not romantic, is it? If you're out on a date with someone, they say, well, I'm kind of doing a risk assessment here, and you've got, I like these qualities, but I think, this is our relationship, this is kind of reducing the likelihood that or you go to someone on a wedding and you say, hey, what's the chance you're going to be divorced in 5 years? And they say, what do you mean? Like, there's 0% of chance. You say, well, it's like 30% of marriages end in divorce, within 5 years, so why are you different? That's not going to win you friends. So, on the other hand, it can make you a lot of money. So, there are downsides of being risk intelligent, sure. Yeah.
Is risk intelligence, is it typically left or right brain decision making, or can it be both?
Okay, so there's a lot of myths about left brain, right brain, and it's all rubbish. So basically, there was, for 10, 15, maybe 20 years, people talked about this all the time. It was in all the business seminars. There's some slight, lateralization in the sense that you do find sort of language more on the left-hand side of the brain and so on, visual stuff more on the right. But on the, this is the idea that you can localize functions doesn't really go in terms of hemispheres. You can localize it in certain smaller areas of the brain, but you can't. I would say, most thinking, complex cognitive activity involves neural circuits that are spread kind of evenly across both hemispheres, and so. If you read any books that talk about left brain any right brain any longer, just throw them away. I mean, it's sad because I was reading one the other day that I really liked, but I just had to throw it away. Yeah.
So, hey, what's your take on the future of needing risk intelligence going forward? I can see on the one hand, there's many more options, there's many more things that we can do, there's much more information to learn. But on the other hand, we've got machine learning, plenty of tools looking after all this for us, recommender systems, flight planning, everything like that, which takes care of some of that.
No, that's a great question because there's, I think that you can see in horse betting, for example, in sports betting in general, it all used to be done by people doing it all in their heads, and now you can't, if you're doing it that way, you're not going to make any money because everybody's building computer models now. So, and the same thing in the finance industry. In the 80s, if you were a trader, you're making a lot of decisions, in your gut. Nowadays, you'll be using a spreadsheet. And that's a good thing, right? If you've got enough data and enough time, you can build a much better model in a computer than you can ever do in your brain. It'll be, you can have 100 variables in a computer. You can maybe keep 7 or 8 in your, in a model in your brain. And it's gonna, but you need the time to make the model. You need the data. You need money to gather the data. You need people to code it and everything. And when you've got big, complex decisions at stake, like financial ones, flight plans, etc., and you have the resources to do that, that's great. But there are many times where you don't have the time or the money or the other resources to do it. If you're a commander in a forward operating base in Afghanistan, and you just have to make you don't have time to gather the historical data that you need to estimate the chances that you will destroy successfully certain targets. You just have to get good at kind of making a rough estimate. So there are still many, in fact, that's most of life. Most of life, you don't actually have the time or the money to build and gather complex data and build a model. So when you do, by all means, use the computer. But if we think that computers are going to make the need for risk intelligence as a cognitive or psychological capacity redundant, we're wrong. And even when we have the data to build good models, there's an argument that even then we need to retain some risk intelligence to be able to kind of have a rough idea of when the models are, the assumptions on which the models are based or the data is no longer applicable. I mean, people in the financial crisis, they had fantastic models. The problem wasn't the models, it was that they're based on 10 years of data when we hadn't had a big crash. So, for when those models go wrong, you've got to have the ability to see when those models are going wrong and retain some benchmark against which you can, psychological benchmark, against which you can have some rough idea, well, hang on, now it's time to abandon the model or gather more data. And I think, so that's partly, I think, why so much went wrong in the financial crisis, is that people were trusting the models too much. There was a whole bunch of people with genuine risk intelligence in Wall Street in the 80s, and then when the models, the physicists and the quants came in and started building the models in the 90s, they got out of Wall Street, mainly because they went to hedge funds and venture capital and other kinds of alternative investment where they could make billions rather than just a few hundred million. And as a result, no hedge fund needed bailing out. No hedge fund suffered in the financial crisis. But there were a lot of banks went wrong because the people who came in there were people who were just trusting the models. They didn't have any of that kind of native risk intelligence that the guys in Wall Street in the 80s had, many of whom were professional, also, not professional, but were regular, avid gamblers. I mean, literally, they played poker every weekend. They played backgammon and stuff like that. Whereas the quants are very different kind of people. I think as a result, Wall Street hemorrhaged risk intelligence in the early 90s. And that, I think, was a part of the less obvious causes of the financial crisis. Yeah.
You may have covered this question already, but just when you mentioned trust, I'm wondering how big is trust in any of that?
Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but I mean, trusting who? I mean, deciding how trustworthy someone is can be a big risk intelligence question, right? You know, what is the probability that this person will keep this secret in this situation? What is the probability that you can rely on this person that's one of the, something that we all of us have to make that decision quite on a regular basis. When some people trust too easily. They overestimate the chance. They have poor risk intelligence in the trust field because they overestimate the chance that someone will be reliable, or they underestimate the chance that someone will cheat on them. How likely is it that your partner will betray you in the next year? That's kind of good risk intelligence question. People actually get worse at this as their relationship progresses because they get overconfident. They think they know the other person. When you start dating someone, your antennae are up. You're looking out. You're evaluating them very carefully. You're checking out, will they be... in fact, I was thinking of even sort of developing a dating risk intelligence test to see if people, to help people, right? Because, we don't, mainly to help women avoid being taken in by, unscrupulous guys, Yeah, well, it does work both ways, but, on the whole, I would say that, and again, I'm opening up myself a huge judge of sexism here. But I would say on the whole that traditionally speaking, most of the rush, the stampede into bed has been led by men who are trying to fool the woman that they will say, yeah, really nice, I'm trustworthy. Oh, of course I'll call you. Come back to, yeah, no problem. And unfortunately, there's like lots of my friends have been taken in by that. So what are the chances that, can you trust someone? I think that's a big part of risk intelligence. Yeah.
So, I'm now slightly confused. I thought risk intelligence was accurately assessing the data in front of you. So if you've been in a long-term relationship of 20 years and they haven't cheated on you, then you've gathered those 20. You're not... it'd be unwise there to compare it against a cohort of men. You should take the most immediate data and weight it most heavily.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. What happens is, so let's say let's say that you've been with someone for 20 years. You're fairly sure they haven't cheated on you. And let's say that let's say the ideal thing would be to give them like a 95% chance that they won't cheat in the following year. Right? People who've been with someone for 20 years will generally say it's 99% or 100%. So they kind of lose whatever initial skepticism they have completely. And as a result, it's easier to cheat on someone that you've been with for a long time than it is to cheat on someone you're going out with just recently. Yeah.
The type of people with high risk intelligence, would they be inclined to go for the big situations? Or would they be driven by going for the money, going for the big things, and as an aside on that, would they be more prepared to accept the consequences than maybe somebody, if you have high risk intelligence, would you just live doing simple risky things, or would you tend to go for the big deal?
Right, okay, so I think that's is a useful distinction to make between risk intelligence and risk appetite. So, just because you've got high risk intelligence doesn't mean you'd have a high risk appetite. And you could have all sorts of combinations. You could have be very good at judging risks, but be very, not really willing to take many risks. I think the worst thing would be the opposite, right? Where you have a high risk appetite, but low risk intelligence, because then you'd be like taking loads of risks and wildly misjudging them, but you'd probably kind of die relatively young. So, these two things are relatively independent. So, yeah, you could, and with risk appetite, there are some gender differences. So with risk intelligence, it does seem that men and women are pretty much the same. But with risk appetite, on average, the women are more risk averse than men. And that's the reason why, almost all the professional gamblers I interviewed were men. Not because men have higher risk intelligence, but because men, on average, are more drawn to taking greater risks than women. And there's even a sort of biological, perhaps evolutionary explanation for this, which is that, the variance for success, reproductive success for ancestral men was, and it was huge. A man who can have hundreds of children, in principle. And I think the record for the greatest number of children is Ismail Moulay the Bloodthirsty, who had 888 apparently, according to the Guinness Book of Records. And lots of men can have 0 children, but most women throughout history have had some children. The unsuccessful, from a Darwinian point of view, women have had 1 or 2 surviving children, and the more successful women have had 3 or 4, but no woman has had like 100 children. So that variance of greater, women can play a more safe strategy, biologically speaking. They can play a safe, they don't have, there's no great rewards for taking massive risks. There's no, so you can play safe. There is, with men, it's a winner-takes-all game. There are massive rewards for being the alpha male, and your genes will spread, widely. But if you're the omega male, as they call them, your genes are going nowhere. So that's why that's the theory about why males have a greater predisposition for taking risks.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
One of the things that we're going to explore in Risk Lab next month is genetic predisposition to developing certain diseases or conditions or disorders. And I was wondering if you think that this will be an area of health where risk intelligence will become increasingly important over the next few years.
Yeah, I think certainly, you can look at biological correlates of risk appetite, and people with low density of dopamine receptors tend to be more risk-loving and more, they tend to be thrill-seeking people, and with high-risk appetite and so on. Because, they get so much more reward from a burst of dopamine because they got it's like flooding their system. Whereas if you've got a bunch of masses of dopamine receptors, you get a little bit of dopamine, it's kind of smoothed out a lot more, theoretically. So they would be more at risk for all sorts of things, addictive behavior and alcoholism and so on. And bungee jumping and all sorts of things. So, maybe, if we bring risk intelligence into the equation, we could sort of direct risk intelligence classes more to those people because they're going to need it more than the people who are, maybe less prone to take risks in the first place. I don't think it'll catch on personally, because risk intelligence is something that people, it's kind of, again, we're kind of back to this kind of curious paradox where if you're not very risk intelligent, you don't think you need it. And if you can benefit from it and learn it if you already have it. Kind of.
And what about the people who are told that they have an X percentage chance of developing cancer because they have a certain biomarker in their genes? Will it be important to educate people in understanding what the actual risk is? Yeah, absolutely. I think this is something that doctors have been struggling with for years. How do we communicate risk to patients? Because if you just tell them that there's an 75%, 87% chance of something happening, most people don't have the mental tools to make sense of that. So how do we bring up the level of risk literacy generally? And I think that would be we're all going to have to get used to making more decisions with this explicit probabilities built in, whether it's health risks, terrorism risks, financial risks, and so on. So I think it'd be worthwhile building this into the curriculum at some level. Why not start in primary school and help people to think about these issues? And there is some evidence that shows that people can even a moderate amount of training can help people get better at this. So in Bangladesh, in rural Bangladesh, they had a risk literacy project to help people understand better the percentages attached to the risk of flooding, which is a really serious problem in Bangladesh. The floods of a few 2 or 3 years ago, killed thousands and thousands of people. And so what they did was they got the imams in local rural mosques to talk about probabilities in their weekly services. And then they had notches on pieces of wood where they would say, what's the probability that the water will rise above this notch on this date? And then people got, then now they can readily understand the probability information that when the Weather Forecasting Centre sends out, says, hey, look, this week there's a 50% chance of flooding. They know they can make their own decisions. They can make them differently. They can set different thresholds, but they can do it in a more intelligent fashion because they are more at ease with this language of probabilities, which, thanks to their local imam.
Thanks. How can we improve our risk intelligence in a particular domain, for example, an entrepreneurial business venture?
Well, the way to do it is just, you can improve your risk intelligence in any domain by basically just making lots of probability estimates. So write down your own predictions, make sure that they have a short time horizon, because if it's over the following year, it'll take you so long to get the feedback that, again, that's not going to be helpful, because remember, one of the characteristics of the highly risk intelligent people is they got rapid feedback. So make your prediction something that will come true or not during the next few days. And then write down your probability estimate. Say not just will it come true or not, but write down. And then when it comes true or doesn't come true, make a note of that. And then calculate your risk intelligence score based on that. And to do that, you can use this spreadsheet on my website, projectionpoint.com. You can download that for free and just put this stuff in there, and you can calculate your own risk intelligence score. If you did that on a weekly basis, I can't guarantee you, but I would say that there's a very high probability that you will find your risk intelligence will increase quite significantly just in the matter of a few weeks, because, as I say, you kind of pick the low-hanging fruit first. Your mind makes that initial improvement quite quickly. Then it's kind of it gets harder and harder to make the improvements as you get better. But that's the best way to do it. It's sort of rather simple, but it's just a question of just practice, just doing it again and again and getting used to that, using those probabilities and thinking in probabilistic terms. Put a probability on everything you see. Take bets. Say to people, I will offer you, odds of 5 to 1 that person over there will tell you to fuck off if you ask them their phone number. Something like that. There are people, so some very interesting gamblers who don't gamble on regular stuff like horses or football. They just offer people odds on anything because they like pitting their wits against other people on anything. It's more of a cognitive thrill than a money-making thing for these guys.
When you were interviewing the poker players, did you find that there was any factor, like a personal factor in them, that led to their risk intelligence going up or down? So, for example, if they're playing in the first round of the World Series or the final table of the World Series, did they say to you that they found their risk intelligence improved or disimproved?
Not in terms of the round they were playing in, but in terms of personal characteristics. There are a number of things. Mostly, as I said before, they're very honest with themselves. So they're brutally honest with other people, and they're brutally honest with themselves. They know their own flaws, they know their own weaknesses, they recognize their own mistakes, and that's why they can learn from them. Also, another thing is that they work really hard, and they're really disciplined. I mean, they think, breathe, dream, sleep, everything, poker, or blackjack if it's blackjack. This is 365 days a year for them. And they're kind of obsessed with it. What's the difference between that and a problem gambler? Because they make money, and the problem gamblers don't. So I joked one day because I was at this gambling conference. We were talking to some people from helping agencies. They said, "How could we help these problem gamblers?" I say, "Well, teach them how to gamble." They wouldn't be problem gamblers anymore, right? And that didn't go down very well, but that would be true, right? Sometimes it looks like the only difference between the really extremely good gamblers and the really bad ones. So they both think about it all the time. They both just don't want to do anything else, but the experts make money. The problem gamblers lose it.
Did they find that there were factors? So, like, if they were did they ever say to you, I find there are things in my life that lead to my risk intelligence increasing or decreasing? Like, I was happy or sad, or I was hungry or I wasn't.
No, I mean, what ultimately I think it is mainly just the hard work and the discipline. What explains that? I don't know. I mean, that's a mystery, right? I mean, some people are just, the problem, anybody can go out there and buy a book on blackjack and learn how to play basic strategy and count cards in a week. You don't have to be a Rain Man genius. It's pretty boring. It's just mechanical. It's rote learning. Anybody can go to a casino and learn and make money, by doing basic strategy. Just download a basic strategy chart, Google it, basic strategy, learn it. And it's not like in that film 21, where there are these MIT whiz kids that are doing it. I talked to the MIT blackjack team, and they're smart, but they're not, as I say, they're not kind of a Rain Man genius. They're just dedicated, they learned it, and I said, well, one of the questions I would ask almost all the gamblers I interviewed is, why don't other people do this then? And the only answer they could come up with is, they're lazy. And why are they lazy? Well, maybe they just can't be, maybe they're not going to make money, really. Maybe they just want a bit of fun, that's fine. But if that's another big difference. Why do the professional gamblers, they gamble to make money. They don't gamble for fun. It's a job. The other gamblers, the leisure gamblers, the problem gamblers, they play for fun. So no wonder they don't make money. That's not their main objective. They think it is, but it's not. If it was their main objective, they would be much more disciplined about it. It's less fun. The professional gamblers don't get so much of a kick out of it. If every time you pulled a slot machine, it paid out, very soon it wouldn't be fun anymore. It would just be work. Maybe well-paid work, but it would just be work.
We have time for one more question. Better be awesome.
I think you might have answered it in the last question, this question. Is there a difference between understanding probability and understanding the consequences of that probability? For instance, we had an earthquake in the Irish Sea yesterday, very small probability of an earthquake in the Irish Sea, but the consequences of it were tiny, but they could have been quite enormous. So is it the problem gamblers and the good gamblers actually, they both could understand probability to the same rate, but not understand the consequences of an action happening or not happening?
I don't know, to be perfectly honest, but I will say that there is one of the features of a good decision maker, including the gamblers or the investors, is that they're able very clearly to distinguish those two elements when they're making a decision. So a lot of people tend to, when they're making a decision, kind of wrap those two things up very quickly in one single act of deciding. Whereas the good decision makers are very good at distinguishing and focusing clearly and separating those things. What's the probability of this happening? What's the impact if it happens? So some people might, they tend to say, right, they allow their estimation or their judgment of the impact to affect their judgment of the probability. That's a classic bad error. So they might think, this is really bad if it happens. Global warming, whatever, could destroy the whole planet, or whatever. So, therefore, I'm going to think it's not going to happen. Or, therefore, I'm going to think it's going to happen. Some people go the other way. They become a doomer, where they think, it's like it's so difficult to get their heads around this that I don't want to be a sucker. I call it like the Noah complex. They want to be Noah with the ark, so that whenever the floods rise, they can go, I told you so. You're not coming in my ark. But, so I think that is a crucial distinction to make, and separating those things and not allowing what you feel about the impact to influence your estimate of the probability. Some people say, they want this team to win, so therefore they think it has a high probability of winning, or they would be disloyal somehow to say, oh, look, I really, I'm a fan of Chelsea, but I don't think they're going to win this match. It's like, what? How dare you? You're not a fan. It's like, well, come on, you should be rational about this. Then again, we're getting into the question of what are the disadvantages of risk intelligence. If you're too rational, that can be socially unacceptable.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to everyone who came along tonight, and please once again help me thank Dylan Evans for speaking to us.
Thank you.